Well, why don't we go ahead and get started because it's time. And I'm going to be talking about ethical issues in working with men. And much of my work in the ethics of psychotherapy has been about the duties and responsibilities of working with those different from the mainstream. That's how some of my work in ethics started, or working with people from diverse backgrounds. Then I realized that one important aspect of this ethical issue is about working with those different from oneself, including for those different from white straight men. In other words, we tend to know most about groups that we identify with, that we feel that we belong to. We know less about groups that are different from us. And so because white men's experience has often been the focus in mental health research design, we assumed that they were the norm and that there was little more to know about working with men. However, in the past 2 decades, the explosion of literature on the psychology of men informs us about the importance of understanding the social construction of gender and some about the biology of gender as well. We all know that the women's movement triggered the critical exploration of men, their power, their social roles, their effects, both positive and negative, of the socialization process. We've been hearing that all day long. Levant, for example, described masculinity not as a normative construct, as we had seen it for decades, but rather as a complex and at times problematic construct. So I realized that true ethical competence required, in addition to the core competence in the psychotherapeutic process, 2 things. One is a thorough knowledge and understanding of the group with whom the client or patient identifies, and 2, self-awareness of our own beliefs, biases, and experiences about our identity groups and how those interact with that of the client or patient with whom you're working. So an ethical approach to counseling men means that we have to understand how men in general are socialized in regard to specific beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and how those vary also according to other factors like sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, ability status, socioeconomic status, and so on, age, young men, older men. In addition, rather than apply those stereotypically, we have to have this knowledge in order to assess individual to individual about how those socialized variables apply or not. So today I'm going to be sharing basic principles in ethics that are relevant to working with those different from oneself, in this case men in particular, as well as some potential ethical dilemmas for discussion among us. Let me add that it's important to be aware of the socialization, biological issues, and potential negative biases related to gender, race, sexual orientation, and so on, even if you are a member of those identity groups. There is such a thing as internalized sexism, internalized racism, internalized homophobia, unless we go through a process of gaining knowledge and understanding about our own identity groups. Although men of color, for example, have privilege by virtue of their gender, they experienced oppression by virtue of their race and ethnicity. Now, I'm going to be using some additional resources today to make some points. Anybody here familiar with Aaron McGruder, the cartoonist who did Boondocks for a while? Yeah, he's doing other things now. In 2003, he published a book called Boondocks, and I used some of his cartoons to make some points. He's sort of a controversial African-American cartoonist. I saw last week that he had a birthday in late May, and he turned 36. I can't believe how young he is to be so brilliant. His Boondocks is about 2 young boys, Huey, who's a leftist named for Huey Newton, and his younger brother, Riley, a gangsta wannabe. And they're living with their grandfather in the Chicago suburbs, and they hate it because they used to be city kids. But here is an example of the concern about internalized racism. Here is Huey on a beautiful snowy day in Chicago with his only other African-American friend in the neighborhood. So he's saying, days like this, I look out at all the snow and I think, man, this is beautiful. Then I wonder, is it really beautiful, or have we just been conditioned to think of everything white as beautiful? Is my mind perhaps not as liberated from the slave mentality as I thought? Then I think, what if snow were brown? Would I find it as nice to look at, or would it look dirty? Is this indicative of that somewhere within my subconscious lurks some heretofore undiscovered self-hate? I don't know. Oh, his friend looks at him and says, I don't know how much an hour of therapy costs, but I think that's going to be your Christmas gift from me. But he persists. He says, I wonder how Farrakhan feels about snow. Okay, so we have to be aware, whether we're members of the group or not, about our own biases and reactions and so on. Let me share a little bit. One of the messages I want you to take from here today is the importance of being aware how your experiences affect how you relate to your clients. So I want to share my own experiences that affect how I relate to men, to white men in particular, or that influence my at least initial reactions to white men. I grew up in a socially segregated community just 30 miles south of here in San Marcos, Texas. At the time that I was going through school in the 60s, public school in the 60s, it was very socially segregated. Whites had their own world, Hispanics had their own world, African Americans had their own world. Trust issues were prevalent, and those can still get triggered for me. I did not have white friends until late college and after, which is really amazing when I think about it. And my first marriage was to a Latino. My second marriage is to a white guy, and that took me a long time to be able to do. We were together 5 years before I could wrap my brain around the fact that I was intimate with a white. I mean, so we have to work through these issues. And so when I started seeing white men in therapy, particularly powerful white men, I had to consult about and manage the feelings that were stirred up in me at times. What happened for the most part as a result of this is that I experienced and realized that all individuals have pain. My objectification of white men as powerful, privileged, and not in need of care and support came crashing down. Now, I knew this intellectually, but learning this in an experientially emotional way was quite a different thing. This does not mean that men do not suffer from attitudes and behaviors that reflect inappropriate entitlement that is off-putting at times. Many, if not most men, are socialized to cope with difficulty and challenges in destructive ways that are distancing, off-putting, controlling, defensive, and violent. But as we heard in the past hour, some of those same traits, characteristics, values, and beliefs can be positive as well. But it does mean that I and we all can better help in the psychotherapeutic process when we understand the pain underneath off-putting, distancing, and sometimes violent behavior. When I got into the literature on men and masculinity as sort of an outgrowth of the literature on psychology of women, I resonated to the psychological science that has been evolving in the last couple of decades in regard to men and men's development. In doing our work competently, we have to have an appreciation for human cultural diversity, including the varied ways that society constructs our identity groups. We have to know what those variations are among people. We have to know when these are relevant, and we have to know when they matter in the problem definition and resolution. We have to be careful not to automatically and perhaps erroneously stereotype based on this knowledge. We have to know when some of these variables are forefront in our psychotherapeutic process and when they're background. Okay, some of these issues come forward at times, and at times they're in the background. So some of the basic issues, this is a review if you've been here all day today, but we know that men are socialized to have a specific set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors based on societal views of masculinity, as are women. The traditional male role emphasizes independence, control over one's destiny, physical prowess, and restriction of emotions. Society reinforces boys to be aggressive, dominant, competitive, emotionally restricted, self-sufficient, and to possess physical and sexual prowess. And once again, these qualities and characteristics can be problematic or they can be positive, depending on the context, the degree, and so on.